Well, right now we are in the middle of a sermon series from the Sermon on the Mount, which is a collection of the teachings of Jesus by a Jewish tax collector turned Christ follower named Matthew. And we are in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. And in this series, we are discovering the Jesus way of life. And nowhere else is there a clearer picture of what the Jesus way of life looks like than in the Sermon on the Mount? Like, if you want to know what is the Jesus way of life all about, you read the Sermon on the Mount. And here's the overarching theme we've been working with throughout this series, the one that we really want you to remember, the one we want you to hang on to for life, and that is the Jesus way of life is the only way of life that can change the way of life on planet Earth. Now, we know there are a lot of agendas out there, and there are a lot of different worldviews out there, and there are a lot of different ideas and ideals regarding the best way forward for the human race that addresses the human condition as well as the condition of our world. But we, as Christ's followers, we contend that the Jesus way is the best way. The Jesus way of life is the only way of life that can change the way of life on planet Earth. And today we're going to discover something that I think is very important to all of us. And that is, what did Jesus say about conflict? And so I just want to begin with the question. I want to ask you, have you ever met someone who loves conflict? Ever met anybody like that? Someone who just loves conflict. One thing I've discovered in life is that some people are just fighters, right? Some people just love conflict. They need conflict. They thrive on conflict. I had a friend growing up. He loved conflict. He was a conflict instigator, whether it was a physical conflict or a verbal conflict. He was always looking for a fight. And he was one of my very best friends all throughout my childhood, but it was a toxic relationship. Any crimes I may have committed growing up, I committed with him. We vandalized a house in middle school, actually. True story. We broke into a pop machine when I was in junior high. Now, soda machine. The early service, somebody thought I said we broke into a pot dispenser. I did not say a pot machine. I said a pop machine when I was in junior high. But it was a toxic relationship. It was filled with conflict. We were best friends, and then we were enemies, and then we were best friends again, and then we were enemies again. And this was the story of our childhood together. One day, my parents, I remember they were at work, and he and I were talking on the phone, and we decided we wanted to paint our bikes. And so he said he had some paint and he'd bring it over to my house, rural Oklahoma. We lived on a farm about 1.5 miles apart. We'd ride our bikes to each other's houses all the time. So he shows up at my house, he's on his bike, he's got his paint, and it's me and my sister, and we're home alone, and we're gonna paint our bikes with my friend who loves to fight. And I'm not sure what happened, but it actually happened an awful lot. But we got into an argument, and the argument turned into a scuffle. And before we knew it, it was a full-blown fist fight. Problem was, there were no adults around to stop us. And so my older sister, she's yelling frantically for us to stop. And my friend, he's actually a year older than me, and he was a whole lot stronger than me, so he's probably kicking my tail pretty good. And we just keep fighting. Until I look up and I see my sister holding a gun. A pellet gun. But we're not talking about one of those wimpy Red Ryder BB gun types of things that just bounce off your skin. This was actually an air rifle that we would use on the farm to run off critters. And so we're fighting, and I finally get away, and she hands me the gun. And I pointed at him. And so he starts running for me, and I shoot him in the leg. And he drops to the ground for a second, and then he doesn't say anything. He jumps up, he gets on his bike, and he rides home. Problem solved. Or maybe not. Hours later, like that night, his mom shows up at our house. And we hadn't heard anything since he rode away that afternoon, but now to complicate matters, my parents were home. Of course, we didn't tell my parents about any of it. And when his mom shows up, she's pretty angry but remarkably controlled. And she tells us my friend is in the hospital having just had surgery to remove the pellet from his femur. But thankfully, he's going to be okay. True story. My friend loved conflict. Now, the surprising thing was he'd get over it pretty quick. In fact, in a few days, we were back together again. We were playing together again, me joking about shooting him joking that he'd get me back eventually, which he did. 2 years later, he jumped off the top of one of our farm trailers. He landed on my back, wrenched my whole body around, and unnaturally broke my lower left leg in multiple places. I was in a cast from hip to toe for months. But that was my friend, and that was my relationship, and it was always filled with conflict, and he was always looking for a fight. And I just wonder, have you ever had anyone in your life like that? No, maybe not on the same level as me and my friend, but someone who thrives on conflict. Ever had a boss who's always pitting coworkers against one another? Perhaps you're a teacher and you have a student who likes to argue with everything. Maybe you have a neighbor who's got a problem with every little thing you do, or you have a coworker who is a conflict instigator. Any of you, maybe raise your hand on this one. Any of you ever had a friend who devolved into an enemy? I think if we're honest, most of us would raise our hand on that one. Maybe you had a former teammate or a roommate who became an adversary. Got a parent critical of everything you do. Sibling who will debate anything. Maybe a social media friend who just loves to stir the pot, and I know I can be that guy. I'm trying to be better. If you have anybody in mind, any faces coming to the forefront? What would Jesus have us do with the instigators in our lives? The people who, for whatever reason, become enemies and adversaries. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48, Jesus says this: "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than the others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, when we read these words, there's, of course, the obvious statements being made. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Love your enemies. Pray for your persecutors. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Sounds like a pretty high standard, doesn't it? Well, let's just take this discussion about what Jesus said, which we just read, to what Jesus might be saying to us today. What are some of the things that Jesus seems to be saying to us in these scriptures that apply and are relevant to our lives today? More specifically, what does Jesus seem to be saying to us today as it pertains to our enemies and our adversaries and to conflict in general? There are 3 things I think are really important for us to consider, for us to share. And if you like taking notes, here's the first thing I want you to consider, and that is that not every hill is a hill worth dying on. That's one of the applications that we can draw from Jesus' words about our enemies and our adversaries and conflict in general, that not every hill is a hill worth dying on. Now, the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament law defined justice like this: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or total and complete fairness. You take my eye, I take your eye. You knock my tooth out in a fight, I knock your tooth out in response. You have a farming accident while borrowing my ox, and my ox dies, you buy me a new ox. If you read through the civil laws of the ancient Hebrew people recorded in the Old Testament, you see lots and lots and lots of rules like these. And today, we call it retribution and restitution. It's retribution if I get you back. It's restitution if you pay me back. Either way, it's known as retributive justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But then Jesus comes along and Jesus says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. He says, if someone tries to take your shirt, give them your coat as well. If someone forces you to walk a mile with them, go the extra mile. Now, just important side note, none of these are life-threatening situations. A slap on the right cheek is a backhanded insult, not a full-fisted threat of bodily harm. Meanwhile, the Roman law in the first century allowed Roman soldiers to commandeer Roman citizens to carry their gear 1 mile, but no farther, because farther than 1 mile would be considered excessive and oppressive. Now, the Jewish people didn't want to carry the Roman gear at all. The point? Not every hill is a hill worth dying on. A backhanded insult is not worth going to fists for. Losing your coat isn't worth losing your life. Refusing to walk a mile carrying the gear of a Roman official isn't worth the prison time for naught. Today, Jesus might say, getting sucked into a debate with a coworker over which political party best represents Jesus, even if you feel confident in your position, isn't worth the damage it will do to your relationship. Or Jesus might say, arguing with a police officer over what you see as an unfair speeding ticket isn't worth escalating to the point where you get arrested for resisting the officer. In fact, I think that last one would probably be the closest modern application to if a Roman official forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Yes, it seems unjust, and in fact, it might be unjust, but it's not worth dying for. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek and hand over your coat and go the extra mile, he's simply saying not every hill is a hill worth dying on. Now, the other side of that statement is realizing some hills are worth dying on. Considering that Jesus, who literally died on a hill, is the source of these words, clearly he believes some things are worth dying for, like you and me. Jesus said, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. He did not say, if someone abuses your children, let them keep on abusing them. I don't believe Jesus was a pacifist as we use that term today, but I do think his words were meant to protect his flock, not enable their oppressors. Not every hill is worth dying on, but some certainly are. And it takes great wisdom and maturity and spiritual discernment to know the difference. So what is Jesus saying here? Well, he's saying not every hill is worth dying on. The second thing he's saying is not every enemy is an enemy worth hating. Not every enemy is an enemy worth hating. One time I was selling an item on Facebook Marketplace. How many of you have sold something on Facebook Marketplace? It's a really interesting forum to sell things. But I was selling this item for $500, and somebody sent me a private note, and it just said $300. Like it wasn't, hey, how you doing? I'm interested in the item you're selling. And not even, would you accept $300? Just $300, that's all it said. And I was like, okay, well, I replied. I said, 400 is the best I can do. And immediately I get another note that says 325. That's all it said. And so I replied again. I said, hey, thanks for your offer, but 400 is the best I can do. And I immediately get another note that said 350. And that's all it said. And so I replied again. I said, 400 is the best I can do. And so he writes, when can you meet? And I said, I can meet anytime next week. And he immediately replies, tomorrow. And that's all it said. It said tomorrow. And I said, well, I'm working tomorrow. But you know what? I think I can get off and I can meet you at 3 p.m. tomorrow if you want to do that. He immediately replies, 6 p.m. And I'm like, my goodness, man, do you want to argue about everything? And so I replied, I was like, listen, the latest I can meet with you tomorrow is 5 p.m. And he says, okay. And he never shows up. And I never hear from him again. And I have to confess, my immediate gut response is to say, I hate people like that. Like, why do people have to be that way? They frustrate me to no end and they make me so mad, and I hate people like that. But the reality is, all he really did was irritate me a little bit. Cost me some time. Not a serious problem. Speaking to much more serious and pervasive problems, Martin Luther King Jr. is famous for saying, let no man pull you low enough to hate him. Matthew 5:43 through 45, Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. The ancient word for love here does not mean affection. Just get that out there. It doesn't mean affection. It doesn't mean you have good feelings for your enemies. The word means regard, esteem, and revere. It carries the idea of treating people with dignity. It's not that you have to like your enemies, but you have to see them as human beings with inherent value. And even if you don't like them, you recognize their innate dignity as humans created in the image of God, that all men and all women are created equally in the image of God and ought to be treated with dignity and offered basic human rights simply because they are human, even your enemies, even those who persecute you. And Jesus was speaking to Jewish people who had been mistreated, persecuted, subjugated, oppressed by the Romans. And he says to them, he says, love your enemies and pray for your persecutors. Why? Because they're created, even they, in the image of God. And so I just want you to ask this question this morning. Ask it of yourselves. Who are your Romans? Who are your Romans? To whom would Jesus have you apply these verses? Not every enemy is worth hating. But what else is Jesus saying in these verses? Well, Jesus is saying that his followers should handle conflict differently than everyone else. Jesus' followers should handle conflict differently from everyone else. 3 weeks ago, we were reminded, it was in our message on anger, that our nation's default emotion is anger. Like, we're angry about everything. And I'll admit, there's a lot to be angry about. But even when there's not a lot to be angry about, we look for something. And the thing is, if you're looking for something to be angry about, you will find something to be angry about. Like, if you want to be angry all the time, you will find reasons to be angry all the time. I am convinced of this. The way of the world is anger. Everybody is angry. And even worse yet, everybody wants to be angry. They seem to get energized off anger. And when you don't know how to handle your emotions in healthy ways, you resort to anger. And our world does not know how to handle their emotions in healthy ways, but Jesus wants his followers to be different from this world. And so in these verses, Jesus says, I want you to handle conflict differently than everybody else. Matthew 5, 46 and 47. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own kind of people, what are you doing more than the others? Do not even the pagans do that? Now, Jewish tax collectors were considered to be, in first century Jewish society, they were bottom of the barrel. They were the lowest of the low, and I'm sure you don't feel that way about tax collectors today. Right? Right? Right. Incidentally, if you don't think Jesus had a sense of humor, think about this. Either Jesus was being really snotty to Matthew when he said this. Matthew was a tax collector. Or he winked at Matthew when he said it. And I think it's likely that he winked at Matthew when he said it. And I think the crowds probably chuckled. And the reason for that is the Mount of Beatitudes, where these words were first spoken. It's not far from Capernaum. I've been to both places. And Matthew sat right outside that synagogue in Capernaum, where Jesus taught sometimes to collect taxes for the Romans. And I've actually stood in that synagogue where Jesus stood. And I've stood next door where Matthew collected the taxes. In this crowd, they knew who Matthew was, and they knew his background, and they knew he was in the crowd. And so when Jesus made a comment about tax collectors, they probably all laughed. But then again, it could have been these very same words that convicted Matthew and compelled him to give up tax collecting and to follow Jesus only 3 chapters later. Tax collectors were the bottom of the barrel, and pagans were outsiders. And so Jesus said, if you don't love your enemies and pray for your persecutors, then you're no different from tax collectors and pagans. And I'm convinced that Jesus would say something similar to us today. Like if you always argue with the people you disagree with in life or in social media, if you're always looking for a fight in real life or virtually online, if you feel like you have to call out everything you disagree with, then you're no different than the rest of the world. In his book, Love Over Fear, Dan White reported the following survey, that 79%, that's almost 8 out of 10, 79% of conservatives feel like befriending their ideological enemies is compromise. Not to let anyone off the hook, 76% of progressives feel like befriending their ideological enemies is complicity. Anybody see a problem there? If you disagree with me, then you are my enemy. This is the way of the world, and Jesus wants us to be different from the world. And what does it look like to be different from the world? Here's the answer. It's really rather simple. We love. That's our default emotion. We love. We treat with dignity even our enemies. So yeah, why should we do that? Why should we? Why should we turn the other cheek, give up our coat, go the extra mile, love our enemies, and pray for our persecutors? Why? Well, here's one answer. obedience. Jesus said to, we just read it. Jesus said it, we obey it. Here's a second reason. Discipleship. It makes us more like Jesus. In Matthew 5:48, it says it makes us more like God, more like Christ. Discipleship is when we become more like Jesus, and the mission of the Christian life is discipleship. If you want a third reason, the third reason is citizenship. It makes society better. It makes the world a better place. I mean, if we are going to pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, then we better be willing to love our enemies, or our prayers are empty. Now, I want you to just think with me for a second. Just try to dream with me for a second. Imagine for a second, could you imagine how much better off society would be right now if we all adopted the Spirit of Christ in our social, political, professional, personal, and virtual interactions? Could you imagine? Could you? Could you imagine how much better off we all would be if Republicans and Democrats said, we're going to turn the other cheek, give up our coats, go the extra mile, and pray for and love our adversaries? Could you imagine? Could you imagine how much better off ethnic relationships would be if people would go, if people of every color learn to turn the other cheek and give up our coats and go the extra mile and love and pray for people who are different from us? Could you imagine? Could you imagine how much better off people with entirely different worldviews would get along on planet Earth if we all learned to turn the other cheek and give up our coats and go the extra mile and love and pray for people even of any and every other creed? Could you imagine? So why would Jesus ask us to do any of this? The answer is because it makes us more like him, because it will draw the world to him, and because Jesus believed it would turn even our enemies into our friends. So here's the takeaway for today, and then we are done. Here it is. Fight like Jesus. Fight like Jesus. Are you a fighter? You want to fight? Fight like Jesus. And how did Jesus fight his enemies? He loved them and he prayed for them. And that's what he calls his followers to do as well. Fight like Jesus. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.